When I turned 65, I cooked enough food for 8 people and waited 6 hours for a family that had already left the country without me. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because I never imagined my story would travel farther than the people who abandoned me. I spent 3 weeks preparing for that birthday dinner. At my age, birthdays stop being about gifts. They become about presence, about hearing familiar voices around the table one more time, about proof that after all the years you spent loving people, raising them, feeding them, forgiving them, they still remember where home is. I polished my grandmother's silverware until I could see my reflection in it. I ironed the white linen tablecloth Richard and I bought during our 20th anniversary trip to Vermont. I even ordered fresh flowers from the florist downtown because Ethan always used to say the house felt happier when there were lilies in the dining room. The roast sat in the oven, keeping warm. Candles flickered softly beside the birthday cake I'd baked myself that morning. Chocolate with buttercream frosting. Noah's favorite. I set 8 plates around the table. 1 for me. 1 for my son Ethan. 1 for his wife Meadow. 2 for my grandchildren. 1 for my sister Diane and her husband. And 1 extra seat, just in case someone decided to bring a friend. By 6:30, nobody had arrived. I checked my phone 3 times to make sure I hadn't confused the date. Then I checked the text thread where everyone had confirmed they were coming. Meadow had even replied with a little red heart emoji the night before. At 7 o'clock, I called Ethan. Straight to voicemail. I told myself there must be traffic. An accident on the interstate. Maybe Noah had soccer practice running late. I kept finding explanations because mothers do that. We turn disappointment into excuses before it has a chance to wound us properly. By 7:30, the candles had burned low enough that wax dripped across the dining table like tears. The roast had dried out around the edges. The ice in the water glasses had melted completely. Still, I waited. The silence inside the house felt strange. Not peaceful. Hollow. Like every room already knew something I didn't. Around 8:15, I made the mistake that changed everything. I opened Facebook. The first photo stopped my breathing for a moment. Meadow stood at the center of the picture wearing a flowing white sundress and oversized sunglasses, smiling against the bright blue backdrop of the Mediterranean Sea. Ethan stood beside her with his arm around her waist. Noah held a giant slice of pizza in one hand, while little Ava laughed beside him. My sister Diane was there too, holding a champagne glass toward the camera. Every single person who was supposed to be sitting at my table was standing on the deck of a cruise ship somewhere off the coast of Italy. The caption read, "Family vacation with my favorite people, red heart, creating memories that last forever." I stared at the screen, so long my eyes began to burn. Then I noticed the timestamp. Posted 42 minutes earlier. While I was still sitting alone at my birthday table waiting for them to arrive. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text from Ethan. "Sorry, Mom. Forgot to mention we'd be away this week. Meadow booked this months ago. Happy birthday, though. Forgot to mention." I read those 3 words over and over while the candles finally burned themselves out beside me. The strange thing about humiliation is that it rarely arrives all at once. People imagine betrayal as a slammed door or cruel words shouted across a room. But sometimes it happens quietly, over years, in little moments your heart tries not to examine too closely. That night, after staring at those cruise photos until my vision blurred, I walked through the house turning off lights one by one. The dining room first, then the kitchen, then the small lamp beside Richard's old recliner. The birthday cake was still sitting untouched beneath its glass cover. 65 years old, and somehow I still believe candles and home-cooked meals could hold a family together. I wrapped the leftover roast in foil and placed it in the refrigerator beside the potato salad Meadow used to beg me to make during holidays. Funny how people can crave your cooking while slowly losing respect for the hands that prepared it. I did not sleep much that night. Around 2 in the morning, I found myself sitting in the den wearing Richard's old gray cardigan, scrolling back through months of photographs and messages like a detective searching a crime scene long after the damage was done. Once I started looking, I could not stop seeing it. Last Thanksgiving, Meadow changed dinner plans at the last minute and said they thought I needed rest. Christmas Eve had suddenly become too crowded for me to host anymore. Noah's middle school graduation happened on a Tuesday afternoon I was never told about. There was even a family beach trip in Cape Cod the previous summer that Ethan later described as spontaneous, despite the matching shirts in every photograph. At the time, I explained everything away. Meadow was busy. Ethan was stressed. Children forgot things. Families changed. That is what older women do when love begins disappearing from a room. We become translators for other people's cruelty. The next morning, sunlight spilled across my kitchen counters while the coffee brewed, and for the first time in years, the silence inside the house did not feel temporary. It felt permanent. I opened my phone and stared at the family group chat. Pictures kept appearing from the cruise ship. Fancy dinners, poolside cocktails, smiling faces beneath foreign sunsets. Meadow posted constantly, as though she wanted the entire world to witness how complete the family looked without me in it. Then I noticed something else. Diane was commenting under every photo. My own sister. Best vacation ever. So grateful for this beautiful family. I set my coffee cup down harder than I meant to. Some of it spilled across the counter. Diane had sat at my kitchen table for 30 years listening to me defend Ethan after every mistake he ever made. She held my hand at Richard's funeral. She cried with me when the doctors said his heart was failing. And somehow she boarded a cruise ship with my family while I sat alone blowing out birthday candles by myself. Around 10 that morning, my phone rang. Ethan. I let it ring twice before answering. The connection crackled from somewhere out at sea. Hey, Mom, he said casually, as though he had forgotten milk at the grocery store instead of abandoning his mother on her birthday. You doing okay? I looked out the kitchen window at the empty bird feeder Richard used to refill every Sunday morning. I am fine, I said quietly. There was laughter in the background. Music, glasses clinking together. Then Meadow's voice drifted through the phone, light and careless. Tell her we will bring her something back from Italy. Something inside me went still after that. Not angry, not even surprised anymore. Just still. Because in that moment, I realized they had not forgotten me at all. Forgetting is accidental. This had been organized, planned, shared. Everyone knew except me. After I hung up with Ethan, I stood in the kitchen for a long time staring at the refrigerator door without really seeing it. There was a small magnet from Niagara Falls holding up one of Noah's old drawings from elementary school. A crooked little picture of our family standing beneath a bright yellow sun. Back then, he used to draw me right in the center holding everybody's hands. Children always reveal the truth adults spend years trying to hide. I poured myself another cup of coffee, even though the first one had already gone cold beside the sink. Outside, the neighborhood looked painfully normal. A man walked his golden retriever down the sidewalk. Someone nearby mowed their lawn. A delivery truck stopped across the street. The world kept moving with insulting ease while something inside my own life quietly collapsed. Around noon, I drove to the grocery store because I could not stand the silence in the house anymore. The cashier wished me a belated happy birthday after seeing the flowers still sitting on the passenger seat of my car. I smiled politely and thanked her. Then I sat in the parking lot afterward longer than necessary, watching families load groceries into minivans while trying to understand when exactly my own family had stopped feeling like mine. On the drive home, memories kept surfacing whether I wanted them to or not. Meadow had not always been cruel in obvious ways. That was what made her dangerous. She operated through suggestion, through small exclusions wrapped in politeness. The first time Ethan brought her home, nearly 12 years earlier, she hugged me tightly and called me Mom before dessert was even served. Richard adored her immediately. She volunteered at church, sent handwritten thank you cards, and remembered everyone's birthdays. But over time, little things changed. She corrected Ethan whenever he spoke warmly about traditions from our side of the family. She laughed when I used recipes she called outdated. She once told Noah that staying overnight at Grandma's house was boring because old people went to bed too early. Tiny comments, tiny cuts, nothing dramatic enough to confront. That was her gift. By the time anyone noticed the pattern, the damage already felt normal. A few days after Richard passed away 2 years earlier, Meadow stood in my kitchen rinsing wine glasses after the funeral reception. I remember the sunlight hitting the diamond bracelet Ethan bought her that Christmas. She looked around the house quietly before saying, "This place is probably too big for one person now." At the time, I thought she was expressing concern. Looking back, I realized she was measuring the walls like a realtor calculating square footage. That evening, while putting groceries away, I opened Facebook again against my better judgment. More cruise pictures. Meadow wearing a wide-brimmed white hat beside the pool. Ethan holding Ava on his shoulders during a walking tour through Rome. Diane smiling beside them at some expensive seafood restaurant with string lights hanging overhead. Then I saw a short video clip Noah had posted. Best family trip ever, he said into the camera while everyone laughed behind him. Best family. The words echoed strangely in my chest because I suddenly understood something I had been avoiding for years. Meadow had not simply removed me from one birthday dinner. She had slowly rewritten the definition of family itself. And somehow, everyone else had gone along with it. 3 days after my birthday, rain rolled across Connecticut in slow gray sheets that made the whole neighborhood look faded around the edges. I spent most of the morning cleaning closets that did not need cleaning. That was another habit grief had given me after Richard died. Whenever emotions became too large to carry, I organized drawers, folded towels, rearranged shelves. Pretended control over tiny things still counted for something. Around noon, I decided to clear out the garage. Richard used to spend entire weekends there repairing old fishing equipment or polishing tools he never actually used anymore. Since his death, I had avoided touching most of his things because the smell of cedarwood and motor oil still lingered in the air like he had only stepped out for coffee. Dust floated through narrow strips of light coming from the small windows overhead. I opened old storage bins carefully, sorting through winter coats, camping supplies, and boxes filled with faded family photographs. Then I found the blue metal toolbox Richard never let anyone touch. I almost left it closed, but something stopped me. Inside were stacks of neatly organized paperwork, old receipts, insurance documents, and several manila folders labeled in Richard's careful handwriting. One folder simply said, "For Loretta." My hands suddenly felt cold. I sat down on the little wooden stool beside his workbench before opening it. The first thing inside was a letter dated 8 months before Richard passed away. I recognized his handwriting immediately. Steady, precise, the kind of handwriting belonging to a man who believed details mattered. "If you are reading this," the letter began, "then there are things I should have explained sooner." I read every line twice. Richard wrote that during the final year of his illness, he noticed unusual withdrawals from one of the family trust accounts. At first, he assumed Ethan was helping with medical expenses, but certain signatures did not match. Transfers were being made quietly in smaller amounts under business expenses and travel reimbursements. Richard hired an accountant friend to review everything privately before confronting anyone. Then came the sentence that made my stomach tighten. "I believe Meadow may be manipulating Ethan financially, or using his access without him fully understanding what is happening." I stared at those words while rain tapped softly against the garage roof overhead. Richard continued explaining that he created safeguards within the trust before his condition worsened. He instructed his attorney to freeze certain assets automatically if irregular activity continued after his death. Attached to the letter was a second envelope containing copies of bank statements highlighted in yellow marker. Repeated withdrawals, luxury purchases, payments toward a boutique consulting company registered under the name of Meadow's younger brother in Miami. Tens of thousands of dollars over time. Quietly moved while I was busy driving Richard to chemotherapy appointments and sleeping beside hospital machines. Suddenly, memories began rearranging themselves inside my mind. Meadow insisting Ethan handle all financial conversations after Richard became sick. Meadow volunteering to help organize paperwork after the funeral. Meadow gently suggesting that keeping up with investments might be too stressful for someone my age. I felt something shift deep inside me then. Not heartbreak. That part had already happened. This was different. Clearer. Colder. Because for the first time, I realized Meadow had never simply wanted distance from me. She wanted control. And Richard had seen it before either of us were willing to admit it. The next morning, I carried Richard's folder into the kitchen and spread every document across the dining table that had once held my untouched birthday dinner. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, but the sky still looked pale and exhausted, the way people look after crying all night. I made toast I never ate and reheated coffee that tasted burned no matter how much cream I added. Then I began reading every page carefully. Richard had organized everything with frightening precision. Dates, account numbers, printed emails, notes in the margins written with blue ink. My husband had always been a quiet man, but when something troubled him deeply, he became meticulous. The highlighted transactions stretched back almost 18 months before his death. Small amounts at first. $2,000. $4,000. $7,000. Always labeled under vague descriptions like consulting expenses, renovation reimbursements, or medical travel coordination. But together, the numbers formed something ugly. Nearly $280,000 had disappeared from various family accounts over time. I felt physically cold realizing this had all happened while Richard was dying in the room upstairs, and I was too exhausted to question anything. There was one printed email exchange between Meadow and a financial advisor that caught my attention immediately. Meadow referred to the trust money as future assets and discussed temporary liquidity issues involving her brother's startup company in Florida. She sounded confident, comfortable, like someone discussing money she already considered hers. I leaned back slowly in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. Then another memory surfaced. About a year before Richard passed away, Meadow insisted the family stop using the old lake cabin in New Hampshire because maintaining it was financially irresponsible. A month later, Ethan casually mentioned Meadow's brother suddenly bought a condo in Miami. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Families help each other sometimes. But now every memory seemed infected with new meaning. Around noon, I called the accountant Richard mentioned in his letter. Harold Bennett, 72 years old, semi-retired. He answered on the third ring with the cautious voice of someone who no longer enjoyed surprises. The moment I mentioned Richard's name, his tone softened. "Loretta," he said quietly, "I wondered when you might call." That sentence alone told me everything. Harold explained that Richard became suspicious after noticing repeated inconsistencies in account reports during his treatments. Ethan technically had authorization access to certain family accounts, but many transfers appeared scheduled during hours Ethan was traveling for work. Harold suspected Meadow had been handling online transactions herself. Richard did not want to believe it at first, Harold admitted. He kept hoping there was another explanation. I stared down at the papers spread across my table. "And was there?" I asked. Silence. Lingered on the line for several seconds. "No," Harold finally answered. "There was not." I expected myself to cry after hearing that, to feel rage or heartbreak or even panic. Instead, I felt something much stranger. Calm. Not peaceful calm. The kind of calm that arrives when confusion finally dies. Because for 2 years after Richard's death, I blamed myself for the growing distance inside my family. I thought I had become old-fashioned, difficult, too emotional after losing my husband. Meadow encouraged that belief gently every chance she got. "You are overthinking things, Loretta. You should rest more. You are too sensitive lately." But I understood now that confusion had protected her. As long as I questioned myself, I would never question her. I looked around the empty dining room slowly. The silverware still gleamed inside the china cabinet. Richard's favorite chair still sat near the window. Everything appeared normal. But underneath that quiet house, something rotten had been growing for years. And for the first time since my birthday, I stopped feeling wounded long enough to become dangerous. The following week moved with a strange kind of clarity. For the first time in years, I stopped rearranging my thoughts to protect other people from consequences. Every morning, I sat at the dining table with Richard's documents spread neatly in front of me while sunlight crawled slowly across the hardwood floors. I highlighted dates, compared signatures, organized transactions into folders. There was something almost surgical about it. Quiet, precise, controlled. Meadow and Ethan returned from Europe the following Friday evening. I knew because Meadow immediately began posting photographs from the airport. Matching luggage, smiling children, expensive gifts spread across their kitchen counter like trophies. I studied those pictures carefully. Ethan looked tired. Meadow looked triumphant. There is a difference. The next afternoon, my phone rang while I was watering the hydrangeas beside the front porch. Meadow's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring once before answering. "Loretta," she said brightly, "we brought you something beautiful from Italy." Her voice sounded sugary enough to crack teeth. "That was thoughtful," I replied calmly. A short silence followed. I think she expected bitterness, hurt, some emotional reaction she could later describe as instability. Instead, I sounded exactly like myself. "We were thinking about stopping by tomorrow," she continued carefully. "The kids miss you." I looked down at the damp soil near my shoes. Noah had not called me once on my birthday. Ava had not texted either. Children only know what adults teach them. "Tomorrow is fine," I said. That evening, I drove into Hartford to meet Harold Bennett in person. His office sat above an old insurance agency downtown, tucked inside a brick building that smelled faintly of dust and coffee. Harold wore thick glasses and suspenders that made him look older than I remembered, but his mind remained sharp. He reviewed several updated account statements while tapping a pencil against the desk slowly. The withdrawals increased after Richard passed, he explained, especially during the first 6 months. I stared at the columns of numbers. Luxury retailers. Resort bookings. Wire transfers connected to Meadows Brothers Company. Did Ethan know? I asked quietly. Harold hesitated. I believe Ethan trusted his wife completely. Sometimes trust makes intelligent people blind. That sentence followed me all the way home. Because Ethan had not always been blind. When he was little, he noticed everything. He used to leave half his dessert untouched because he worried I never bought enough for myself. After Richard lost his first job during the recession, Ethan secretly sold baseball cards to help pay for groceries. Somewhere along the way, my thoughtful little boy became a man who could vacation across the Atlantic while his mother sat alone at a birthday table. But even then, I still believed Meadow had helped shape that version of him. By Sunday afternoon, they arrived carrying expensive shopping bags and forced smiles. Meadow air-kissed my cheek before placing a small designer scarf in my hands. Straight from Florence, she announced proudly. Ethan stood awkwardly near the doorway while the children wandered toward the kitchen. I thanked her politely and folded the scarf carefully across my lap. Then I noticed something interesting. Meadow kept studying my face between conversations, searching for damage. She wanted to see evidence that the cruise had broken me. People like Meadow do not simply want distance. They want emotional confirmation of power. But I had already crossed into a different kind of silence by then. One that frightened people more than anger ever could. Before leaving, Meadow paused beside the front door and smiled sweetly. You seem better than I expected, she said lightly. I returned the smile without blinking. So do you, I answered. 2 days later, I mailed invitations for a family dinner. Real paper invitations. Cream-colored cardstock with gold trim that I found at a little stationery shop downtown. I addressed every envelope by hand the way my mother taught me decades ago. Ethan and Meadow, Diane and Frank. Even Noah and Ava each received their own cards. On the front, I wrote only 4 words. Sunday dinner at home. Nothing else. No explanation. No emotion. By then, I had already met twice with Harold and Richard's attorney, Margaret Ellis. Margaret had known our family for nearly 20 years and possessed the kind of calm expression that made dishonest people nervous without understanding why. We sat together inside her office reviewing trust documents while rain tapped against the windows softly. Richard prepared more protections than you realized, she explained while sliding several folders toward me. If fraudulent activity can be established, certain inheritance distributions can legally be suspended. I nodded slowly. Every sentence felt heavier than the last. Margaret also confirmed something I had quietly suspected after reading Richard's notes. Meadow never technically had direct authority over the trust itself. Most likely, she used Ethan's account access while presenting transactions as temporary financial adjustments connected to family planning or business investments. Ethan may not have understood the full extent. Or perhaps he simply never asked enough questions because trusting his wife felt easier than doubting her. Sunday arrived warm and humid. The kind of summer evening where the air clings lightly to your skin even after sunset. I spent the afternoon preparing dinner exactly the way I always had. Pot roast, rosemary potatoes, green beans with almonds, homemade peach cobbler cooling beside the kitchen window. The familiar routine steadied me. Somewhere deep inside, part of me still mourned the woman I had been before all of this. The woman who cooked because she wanted everyone happy, not because she was preparing the final scene of an illusion. At 6 o'clock sharp, headlights pulled into the driveway. Through the front window, I watched Meadow step out first wearing a pale blue dress and carrying a bottle of wine like someone arriving at a charity event. Ethan followed behind her looking distracted. Diane avoided my eyes almost immediately. Interesting. Guilt has posture. Inside the dining room, everything looked beautiful. Candles glowing softly. Silverware polished. Fresh flowers arranged in the center of the table. Nearly identical to my birthday dinner except this time every chair was occupied. Meadow complimented the house within minutes. You always make everything feel so elegant, Loretta. she said sweetly while unfolding her napkin. I do my best, I answered calmly. Throughout dinner, she behaved perfectly, laughing lightly, refilling wine glasses, asking the children about school. Anyone watching from outside would have seen a warm family gathering filled with comfortable conversation. But beneath the surface, tension moved quietly like a crack spreading through glass. Halfway through the meal, Noah mentioned the cruise. Grandma, you would have loved the Amalfi Coast, he said innocently. Meadow quickly touched his arm beneath the table. Too quickly. I noticed. Ethan noticed too. The room fell silent for a second before Meadow smiled brightly. We should all plan another family trip sometime, she said. Another trip. As if the first exclusion had never happened. I set my fork down carefully beside my plate. Then I stood and walked slowly toward the china cabinet near the dining room wall. Inside sat several large manila envelopes Margaret prepared earlier that afternoon. When I returned to the table carrying them, conversation stopped completely. Even the children sensed something changing in the room. I placed one envelope gently in front of Ethan, one in front of Diane, one directly in front of Meadow. Nobody moved at first. Meadow's smile flickered almost invisibly around the edges. What is this? She asked lightly. I folded my hands together and looked directly at her for the first time in weeks without confusion clouding my thoughts. The truth, I said quietly. For a few seconds, nobody touched the envelopes. The only sound in the room came from the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead and the faint clink of Ava's spoon against her water glass. Meadow looked at Ethan with a small, uncertain smile, the kind people use when they still believe they control the situation. Ethan opened his envelope first. I watched his face carefully as he pulled out the bank statements, highlighted transfers, and copies of signatures connected to the family trust. At first, he looked confused, then pale, then something else. Something closer to frightened. Mom, he said quietly, staring down at the papers. Meadow reached for her own envelope immediately, flipping through the documents faster with every page. Her posture changed almost instantly. Her shoulders stiffened. The warmth disappeared from her face. What exactly is this supposed to mean? She asked sharply. I folded my napkin carefully onto the table before answering. It means your name appears connected to $280,000 missing from family accounts. Diane inhaled softly across the table. Frank lowered his eyes toward his plate. Ethan kept reading silently, his forehead tightening deeper with every page. This is ridiculous, Meadow snapped. Those were authorized transfers. I nodded calmly. Some were. Many were not. The room grew painfully still after that. Meadow laughed suddenly, but there was no humor in it. Only panic wearing confidence like cheap perfume. Loretta, you are misunderstanding financial paperwork. Ethan knew about all of this. Ethan looked up immediately. I knew about some investments, he said slowly. Not this amount. Meadow turned toward him so fast her chair scraped against the hardwood floor. We talked about helping my brother launch his company, she insisted. You agreed. Not $280,000, Ethan answered quietly. I noticed then that Noah had stopped eating completely. Ava looked confused, glancing nervously between her parents. Children always know when adults are lying, even before they understand the details. Meadow looked back at me with cold disbelief settling into her expression. So this is what this dinner is? She asked. Some kind of attack. I almost smiled at that word. Attack. As though truth itself had become offensive to her. No, I said softly. The attack happened long before tonight. Ethan slowly turned another page. I could see the exact moment he recognized one of the signatures. This is mine, he whispered. Then he looked closer. No, it looks like mine. Harold had prepared side-by-side comparisons. Real signatures beside forged ones. Close enough to fool a distracted husband. Not close enough to survive professional review. Meadow's breathing became uneven after that. You are making me sound like some criminal, she said, her voice trembling now. Everything I ever did was for this family. I held her gaze steadily. No, I answered. Everything you did was for control. The words landed harder because I never raised my voice. Meadow opened her mouth again, but nothing came out immediately. For the first time since I had known her, she looked unprepared. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair, staring at his wife like a man suddenly realizing he had spent years living beside someone he never truly understood. Then came the moment I think hurt Meadow most of all. Not anger. Not accusations. Silence. Nobody defended her. Not Diane. Not Frank. Not even Ethan. The room simply sat there wrapped in the heavy quiet that follows a truth everyone secretly suspected but never wanted confirmed. Finally, Meadows stood abruptly and grabbed her purse from the floor. "I am not staying here for this," she said coldly. I nodded once. "I know," I replied. "You only stay where people still believe you." Meadow left first, but the damage stayed. Sitting at the table long after the front door closed behind her. Nobody reached for dessert. The peach cobbler cooled untouched beside the kitchen counter, while silence settled across the dining room like dust after a storm. Ethan remained frozen in his chair, staring down at the documents spread before him. I had never seen my son look old before that night. Not tired, not stressed. Old. Like someone realizing the life he trusted had quietly shifted underneath him years ago. Diane wiped at her eyes with a napkin before finally speaking. "Loretta," she whispered, "I did not know about the money." I looked at my sister carefully. "But you knew about the cruise," I answered softly. Her face collapsed after that. Some betrayals happen through cruelty. Others happen through cowardice. Diane chose the second kind. Ethan gathered the papers slowly into one stack with trembling hands. "Mom, I swear to you, I did not know the full amount," he said quietly. "I thought Meadow was moving money around temporarily for investments." I nodded once because, strangely enough, I believed him. That was the tragedy of it. Ethan had not become malicious. He had become passive. There is a difference, but the damage often looks the same to the people left behind. After everyone finally left that evening, I stood alone in the kitchen rinsing dishes beneath warm water while the house returned to silence again. But this silence felt different from the one after my birthday. That silence carried humiliation. This one carried clarity. Upstairs, I opened the bedroom window beside Richard's side of the bed and let the cool night air drift through the curtains. For the first time in months, I slept deeply. The following weeks changed everything quietly. Margaret formally froze several remaining trust distributions while investigators reviewed the financial records. Meadow moved into a luxury apartment downtown temporarily after separating from Ethan. According to Diane, she spent the first few days insisting everyone had exaggerated the situation. But truth becomes difficult to manipulate once paperwork enters the room. Ethan started coming by the house alone on Sunday afternoons. At first, conversation felt awkward and painfully careful. We spoke mostly about ordinary things. Weather, the children, baseball games on television. But little by little, pieces of my son began returning. One afternoon, while helping me clean the garage, he found Richard's old fishing tackle box and sat quietly for nearly 10 minutes without speaking. "Dad knew, did he not?" he finally asked. I nodded. Ethan lowered his eyes after that. "I think part of me knew too," he admitted softly. "I just kept telling myself everything was fine because it was easier." Honest words sound different when people finally earn them. By the time autumn arrived, the trees outside my neighborhood had turned deep shades of orange and red. Noah began visiting after school again twice a week. Ava helped me bake cookies in the kitchen while telling me stories about her friends. The house slowly started sounding alive again. Smaller than before. Quieter too, but honest. On my 66th birthday, I did not organize a giant dinner. I used my everyday plates instead of the expensive china. There were only 5 people at the table that evening. Ethan, Noah, Ava, Diane, and me. No candles arranged perfectly. No polished silverware. No desperate hope disguised as celebration. Just warm food and people finally looking at one another without pretending. Near the end of dinner, Ava climbed into my lap and wrapped her little arms around my neck. "Grandma," she whispered, "I am glad you did not disappear." I held her a little tighter after that because children say the things adults spend years avoiding. Later that night, after everyone left, I sat alone beside the dining room window with a cup of tea resting between my hands. The table looked smaller now somehow, but also lighter. And as I watched the porch light glow softly against the dark, I realized something important. Some people leave your table so you can finally see who deserves a seat there in the first place.